Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Friday, April 23rd. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Minnesota game is in 132 days. The game against Michigan in 218 days. Last season's Ohio State offense was probably good enough to win a national championship, at least until Trey Sermon broke his collarbone on the first carry against Alabama. The defense, on the other hand, needed a lot of help from that offense. So how much is going to change this year for the Ohio State defense as they try to fix all of that? Buckeye Scoop's X's and O's guru Ross Fulton joins me this morning. Ross, after 2 years of talking about it, it's starting to look like the bullet position might finally be something that Ohio State fans actually get to see out on the field for more than a handful of plays each game this fall.
That's true. You could make an argument that in 2019, Pete Werner effectively was a bullet, quote unquote, in terms of being a hybrid between a safety and a linebacker, in the sense that he, sporadically would roll back to a deep middle of the field safety or line up as a split safety, cover a tight end and man coverage. But I think that this is a more wholesale commitment to making sure the person at that position can function as effectively another safety on the field.
Well, I mean, that was 2 years ago. I mean, Pete Werner was in that Sam spot in 2019, and they did use him at that deep safety spot, and it seemed like there was a lot of flexibility there. And then last year they moved him to the Will spot, and then Baron Browning took over at Sam, and he was, normally that's like a hybrid, you think of that now as a hybrid spot, like sort of a little bit of a Sam, a little bit of a safety, you got chocolate in my peanut butter and all that. But he was like old school Sam linebacker. Like there was no safety in his game at all. He was like Sam linebacker / defensive end, almost trending the other direction if he was a hybrid player. And then, so Werner was closer to the more modern role. So what kind of impact did that have on the field for Ohio State last year that they didn't have that kind of guy at Sam?
I think it had a lot. It really limited what they could do coverage-wise, and both in disguising coverage and just in executing itself. So we gave the one example where, Pete Werner in 2019 would line up as a Sam linebacker, and then they would roll their cover three the other way. So, the deep safety at the time, Jordan Fuller, would come down, to play an underneath zone. Werner would roll back to a deep third. And, so you could disguise things where blitzes were coming from, what kind of, where your coverage was going. Last year, they couldn't do any of that, or at least they didn't ask for Aaron Browning to do any of that. Instead, when they wanted to use, even variations of cover three, let alone other types of coverages, they would then have to move what we're now calling the cover safety back to align pre-snap in a split safety role, and then roll one way or the other. And so obviously that gives away quite a bit to the offense when you see pre-snap that Ohio State's doing something different, as opposed to being able to be more flexible post-snap. And so it basically went from having, essentially someone who you could, even with Werner, plausibly call it a second safety on the field, along with the three corners, if you will, to really just having, a true linebacker. And so it just was another limit on what they could do.
Well, you wrote an article this week called Analyzing the Bullet Position that is free on BuckeyeScoop.com. You do not have to be a member to read that. It is fantastic content. You will read it and you will walk away a little smarter than you were when you started it. I will link that in the post for this podcast on the front page of BuckeyeScoop.com to make that easy to find. But in that article, you talked about the fact that this is where the sport seems to be going. There are a lot of other programs that have been turning that Sam linebacker into more of a hybrid spot, or even just like a straight up defensive back. So can you explain why that's happening across the sport right now?
Yeah, I would say Ohio State's way behind the game at this point. They're like the last adopter of, I think Alabama and Nick Saban's a good example. Frankly, they basically went this way after their 2014 loss in the Sugar Bowl to Ohio State, from basing out of essentially a 3-4 defense at the time to, they do a lot of things, but I would say what they use more than anything else is a 4-2-5 nickel, with essentially the nickel being the same as Ohio State's cover safety, lining up over the slot. And the reason is because, the overwhelming majority of college offenses these days, their base personnel is the quarterback in the shotgun with 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and 1 running back. And so just to match up personnel, if an opponent has 3 wide receivers on the field, you either have, 2 safeties with 3 guys lined up over them in a nickel, or if you're going to, be like what Ohio State did and insist on playing 3 linebackers, you basically have 1 of 2 choices. You only have 1 deep safety and the 3 linebackers up and the 3 guys covered. Or if you want to go to 2 deep safeties, then you need to start using your linebackers to essentially align over those wide receivers. And so Ohio State had problems with both last year, to be honest. So, obviously, playing one deep safety, limits what kind of coverages you can use, even if as a change up, just occasionally mixing in a split safety coverage. Or, we saw Alabama take a lot of advantage of Ohio State's linebackers by, lining up Devontae Smith all over the field. And, Ohio State, it was just difficult to adjust because you got to pull those guys way out of the box. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility defending the pass. And really, in this day and age, offense is a lot of, creating points in football is explosive plays, and you create explosive plays overwhelmingly out of passing the football. And so, Ohio State was great last year at defending the run, but that only gets you so far when you can't defend the pass.
Well, and then, if you're trying to read anything into what the defense might look like this fall, it sure looked like the bullet was going to be just like, that's just the base defense now, like at least based on the spring game. And again, you don't want to read too much in the spring game because you never know. But, if it was going to be the base this fall, that's a lot like what the spring game probably would have looked like. So how do you see things shaking out personnel wise in that defensive backfield? I mean, if Craig Young is the bullet, let's assume Sevyn Banks and Cameron Brown are both healthy for week one. How do you think the 5 defensive backs maybe line, if you include the bullet, line up out there?
Yeah, I mean, the spring game, they were very vanilla otherwise. So if the bullet was only going to be a changeup, they wouldn't have done it. In other words, I think this is what they got. I don't think they're practicing with the Sam linebacker. It's a good question on personnel. I feel comfortable saying Josh Proctor is going to start at the deep safety or free safety role. Banks and Brown. I think cover safety, it's still a little unknown how they're going to work that out between Latham Ransom and Marcus Williamson. Williamson obviously didn't play in the spring game, so we didn't get quite a glimpse of, and I think it's a question, do they still use what, even with the bullet, essentially bring another defensive back in on third down so you have both those guys on the field together at the same time? And, similarly with the bullet, I mean, you have a couple of pretty different body types there, and Young and then Ronnie Hickman. And, you've been in practice more than me, obviously. So, it looked like in the limited drills I saw that Hickman went ahead of Young, which is sometimes a sign that he might start. But I also could see them kind of in a rotation where Young is, even though it's a bullet, he's more of the linebacker of the two of them. And so he plays more on first downs or against Wisconsin of the world, whereas Hickman's more in passing situations, unless they think one of those guys can handle all of it. But it does give them flexibility to sort of mix and match personnel there between the two of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you do still have to play Wisconsin every once in a while, and they'll schedule Army out of conference, or they'll schedule one of those teams. So you do kind of have to be able to do a little bit of everything, and just with that personnel group, just that one small personnel switch, it's kind of, I mean, it's not a different defense, but you can kind of just it's a little adjustment that could make a pretty big difference in terms of how well you can defend and the types of offenses you can defend.
Yeah, exactly. Because as I talked about in my article, and you could see in the spring game, when you put, depending on where the tight end aligned, altered where the bullet aligned. So if the tight end was in a Y off position, or right behind the offensive tackle, or, if you were playing in Wisconsin, he's, in a traditional tight end position, the bullet comes down more like a linebacker, whereas the tight end is more flexed out, or, in a more of a receiving position. He deepened, got more depth. So he's more in a pass first alignment. So, again, they've just given themselves more flexibility. They haven't really changed the scheme in terms of, they're still probably going to be primarily a cover 1, cover 3 team with the middle of the field safety, but it just lets them do more within that scheme and then mix in some change.
Was there anything else during the spring game that really jumped out to you, or was that kind of the one big thing that was your major takeaway from the spring game? Anything else that really jumped out to you during the spring game, either from a personnel perspective or just an overall hey, this is maybe significant from a scheme perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the biggest, because that's just the most fundamental change. They seem to have gotten the message last year about the pass coverage, and this was definitely a step that I've been pounding on them to take for a while, and so I think it's a step in the right direction. I thought a couple of things on offense, which these could be more of a spring game, sort of working on things as opposed to big shifts. But I thought the passing game was much more underneath timing based than sometimes what they did the last couple of years with Justin Fields trying to push the football down the field. I thought there was a little bit more quick game or underneath spacing, quick out routes. And similarly, they seem to really be working on in the run game, run plays that go to the same side as the halfback, in their base spread set. So the two that stood out, they ran some, counter trade to that same side where they're pulling two guys to lead and the running back kind of cuts back behind them. Or they ran some what's called pause option. And so they're running option to the same side. It's supposed to sort of initially look like they're going to run tight zone away from the halfback, and then they run option. They're both ways to, again, play off their base zone run plays that tend to go away from the halfback and prevent defenses from overcommitting to that, hey, we see a halfback to this side, we're going to slant to the opposite side, and trying to guess. So, it could be one of those things where they just want to put it on tape for opponents. So, hey, we got to be worried about to the halfback side, or it could be something that they think that they, need to incorporate more into the offense, or a little bit of both.
Well, and, the quick game stuff with the quarterbacks could just be, these are young quarterbacks, these are maybe easier throws for them as there's, get some confidence, see how they do with the easier stuff. And then don't do the lower percentage stuff with them. The change in the running game, do you think that's reflective of, could that be reflective similarly of personnel where it's like, hey, we think our running backs might be better suited with some of this stuff? Or, is that reading way too much into it?
No, I think you're right. I think it's particularly Master Teague specific. He's not really, it doesn't really fit his style to run like those mid zone or wide zone plays where you saw like, J.K. Dobbins or Trey Sermon cut it back across the grain, so to speak. He's much more of a downhill runner. And so, if you can mix tight zone, which hits quickly, with like that counter play or gap runs, or you can get going north and south behind linemen, that would make sense for him in particular.
Well, you can find Ross's article analyzing the bullet position for free at buckeyescoop.com. I will include a link to that article, as I mentioned, in the front page post for this podcast, that it's nice and easy for you to find. And if you read that and you feel smarter afterwards, and spoiler alert, you will, just imagine how much more great content there is like that available to our members. We have a bunch of great free content up there every day, which is, that's great. But I posted something yesterday about the new NCAA rules about overtime, for example. Mark Givler wrote about the changes coming to the Ohio High School Athletic Association football playoffs. We have lots of fun content like that. Tony Gerderman has had a ton of insightful stuff on position by position breakdowns coming out of the spring. That's all free. That's all at buckeyescoop.com. You should absolutely check that out. Once you do that, hey, there's a lot more great stuff on our Ask the Insiders board that is exclusive to Buckeye Scoop members. Tons of really interesting insight from our recruiting analysts. Nevada Buck churning out great stuff from his Wise Men. We're having a very special for Wise Men Day, takeover day on buckeyescoop.com next week, where you will actually get to interact with the guys behind the guys. Like Nevada Buck has always been kind of the guy behind the curtain. The Wise Men are the guys behind the curtain behind the guy behind the curtain. That was a lot of curtains and a lot of guys, but you know what I mean. They are you will get to finally for the first time ever interact with the 4 Wise Men. That is going to be a very special day at buckeyescoop.com, and it will be just for Buckeye Scoop members. That'll be coming up on, I believe, Thursday next week. So you're going to want to become a member before that. You can just sign up there at buckeyescoop.com. It's the price of like a couple lousy cups of coffee. Just skip those. Treat yourself to a month of buckeyescoop.com instead. And also make sure you check out all of our great podcasts. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, you name it. We're there. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. You can subscribe right there. Also leave us a 5-star rating and review. The Gives in the Bank podcast is churning out. They just released their first ever national top 100, Scoop 100 national recruiting rankings. That's something that people have been asking us for a year. Mark and Bill have finally put it together. They put a lot of work into that. And they're releasing new episodes of Gives in the Bank to talk all about those. They released players 100 through 91 on Wednesday. 90 through 81 should have gone up last night at some point. I forgot to check. And then they'll continue releasing those as the days go on. So you probably want to check out the Gives in the Bank podcast as well. And finally, if you don't want to subscribe to a podcast, you can just find it on YouTube, youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. All of our podcasts are there, including Gives in the Bank, including this, including Buckeye Weekly, including all of our stuff. We're also talking to Ryan Day and the coordinators a little bit later on today. That'll be up there as well once we do that. And just go to youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. And if you hit that subscribe button, you'll get notified every time we post a new video, whether it's a podcast, camp video, player interviews, coach interviews, you name it. It's all there. youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. That'll do it for today. Hope you guys have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend. We will talk to you on Monday.